Welcome to this week's episode of Teshuah Unveiled Podcast. I am your host, Brad Hopp, and I'm joined by Pastor Sam Jones. Together, we are unveiling deliverance one episode at a time. We'll be discussing the latest in trafficking news, insider stories from those being delivered, and studying the Founders Bible to learn how to return America to sanity and true freedom. Our sponsors for today's show are Teshuah Tea Company and Dynamic Script. Alrighty, hi folks, I'm Brad with Teshuah Tea Company and Teshuah Unveiled, and this is my friend, Pastor Sam Jones. And you are listening to the Teshuah Unveiled podcast. And so we're going to just jump into stuff here today. And for those of you that don't know, I'm hoping by now you've heard the stories, but my partner Andrew is a missionary in communist Asia, and he and the team rescue underage girls out of sex trafficking and get them into our rescue and rehab house where they're given an education. We meet all their physical needs as far as food, shelter, clothing, all that stuff. We teach them different work crafts and skills, how to make bracelets and coasters and harvest and process tea and coffee. And so that's where Teshuah comes in or Teshuah Tea Company comes in, because we then buy the products from the girls, giving them economic empowerment, and then half our profits and 100% of our donations are going back to the rescue facility. So we're going to kind of jump right into it. I do want to get into the tea sample here before we get too far in.
Say no.
Yeah. So anyway, this is one of our 500-year-old tea tree pearl tea balls. The tree is literally 500 years old. They call it an ancient tree.
And how old were you when you planted that tree?
Oh, probably 10.
Oh.
So we were laughing beforehand that we both used to work at Fairway here in Iowa, and it's a grocery store chain. And my favorite joke to pull on customers when they were checking out was that if they had a total of like 1785 or 1632 or whatever, I'd always joke, I'm like, oh, that was a good year, and they're like, what?
So, I really shouldn't laugh that hard at that joke, but that's a great joke.
It was fun. I enjoyed it. It was always fun watching their dumbfounded looks and like, what? Get out of town. So we'll let that start steeping there. This is one of our tea kettles that we offer on the site, or a tea brewer that we offer on the site, and you can see that the tea ball in here will start expanding here soon. Mm-hmm. But so these do take a little bit longer than the loose leaf, but this just sits in here, and then there's a little button right here that when I close the lid I can still push, and it drains all the water down into the lower part of the kettle here, and so we'll let that sit there and steep for a few minutes. But
in tea balls, you can re-steep again. That's the one nice thing about it. And the expansion that happens is where all the flavor comes from, and so it's...
This is actually a 6 to 7 gram. They kind of vary a little bit, but they're typically 6 to 7 grams of tea. So this will make quite a bit of tea. We also, and one of the things that I know we've talked about it in the past on past shows, you have the American style of brewing and you have the Chinese method of brewing. And the Chinese method is a much shorter steep time. They actually rehydrate the leaves for 30 seconds, a minute, whatever, a shorter time there, and then they will actually, let me take that back. They steep it for a short time period of just to rehydrate, 20 seconds or so, and then they'll pour that off, and then they actually do their first steep, and they usually do anywhere from 30 seconds to about a minute, so you get more steeps out of the tea, so you're making a lot more. And I know that you were talking, you were like, well, I thought that was going to be weak or whatever.
Yeah.
And it really is, surprisingly, it's not, because of the whole leaf. Right. If you're doing the powder stuff, yeah, it's going to be weak. It's not going to be near as strong. But with the whole leaf, you got more surface area there, and it's just larger leaves. And so it actually is stronger.
Right, yeah, because that does make a pretty big difference. Like you said there, I mean, obviously that tea doesn't look like, the prototypical, and I feel like I bash on these guys all the time, Lipton tea. Right. It's not a tea bag, and that's because real tea doesn't come in a bag.
Right.
But it, or at least doesn't steep in a bag, and it ends up expanding like that, and so you can start to see the expansion there.
Hopefully.
I'm starting to wonder. Hopefully, we didn't wait too long to before we.
No, I think
we started.
It's still pretty hot.
So, but it ends up
Yeah.
Yeah, it looks good, but it ends up doing that, and it ends up being pretty good tea. And of course, that's a really nice thing about this tea is it's good quality tea. I'm a tea snob, so believe me when I say it's good quality tea. But it's also for a good cause. And the thing that I love about this, and I said this several times, it's not just the normal ministry of focusing in on the soul alone, or just focusing in on the body. There's some ministries that go out there, they do good things like dig wells. Nothing wrong with that.
Right.
But a lot of times they leave the Bible out of it, leave the gospel out of it, leave that lifestyle out of it.
Right.
Then there's some ministries that just go out and preach the word. Nothing wrong with that. Good,
Right.
Great thing. This does both, and it gives the young ladies an opportunity to really equip themselves for life, and then of course spiritually equip them.
Right.
As we were talking with the missionary there, it really equips them so that they can actually live out that faith and really learn it. I mean, it's just an incredible thing.
Right.
I mean, the whole ministry started actually basically from a restaurant kind of a thing.
Yeah, it did, and we were talking to Andrew last week about that, and he just started a restaurant there in the town that he works in, or the major town that he works in, and so he, I was setting my timer on that, but so you can see how much that's expanded already, and I mean that T-ball was only about that big, so we got pretty good expansion there. Oops. And pretty good spillage too.
Yeah, well,
It might be a short between the chair and the teapot.
I think we'll be okay. So, yeah, and that is one thing I would say is I'm really good at spilling tea, not just drinking it, but spilling it. So,
Yeah, I have 6 kids at home, so
yeah, what kind of tea is this too?
this is a 500-year-old ancient tree pearl tea ball.
Okay.
So it's just it's a 500-year-old ancient tree.
The tea is not 500 years old. It's the tree, which it does make a difference.
And that's something I should explain too, because the more ancient the trees, the better the tea. And I'll let you go ahead and pour that. I'm just trying to clear mine out here a little bit. But the more ancient the tree, the higher quality of the tea. So the more trees that you have that are 500 years old, or what they would consider ancient trees, that's where the really high quality tea comes from. Did I steep it long enough?
Yep. Yeah, that's good.
Okay. So then that I'll wipe up my mess here a little bit, but so that's the thing. I mean, we have some teas that are from 90-year-old wild trees. We have some that's from 80-year-old trees. But like I said, when you start getting up into the 500-year-old trees, that's where you start getting the really high grade, limited production, fairly exclusive. I mean, I gave you guys one of the tea cakes this morning, and that tea cake retails for $125. So I mean, it's 357 grams.
You're going to get a lot of.
You're going to get a lot of tea out of it,
Yeah.
and the other thing is too that something that I want to throw out there is, and I'm not a drinker by any stretch of the imagination, but people will go out and spend $40, $50, $60 on a bottle of wine, or whatever it may be. And like I said, I'm not a drinker, so I don't even know what wine costs, but I do know that you can get into some really, really hyper expensive bottles of wine and stuff, and it lasts all of one sitting, and it's gone.
And you don't remember it the next day.
Yeah, and you don't remember the next day, And where the tea, you might spend $6.50 or $18 or whatever and get 50 grams or 100 grams of tea. But the thing is that's going to make a lot of tea, and so when you really take it down to a cost per cup, it's like 50 cents or something. Yeah. It's not much.
Much cheaper than Starbucks coffee too. Right?
Exactly, and I'm even talking on the really expensive teas, that 50 cents a cup.
Right.
So for a really special occasion, that's
and cups bigger than this too. We're talking about. So
I'm talking
these
about
are just sampling cups.
Yeah. So I'm talking about bigger cups and special occasions and whatnot, and you can see that, or hopefully you can see that mine's gotten darker here. the more steeps. And that's the thing that I appreciate about these teas is as you do more steeps on the shorter times, it changes the profile of the tea as you go along, so you get it where the flavor profile might be a certain, for lack of a better word, profile on one cup. It's going to get sweeter, or it's going to change on the next cup, and the next cup, and the next cup, and the next cup. And so it changes, and the color will change, and the color will get darker or whatever. And it develops a little bit more. See, now I'm getting more of the dry mouth feel from it.
Yep.
A little bit more, and
a little bit more of the earthy tone in that. Mm-hmm. It's good tea. Good tea.
So
and when I say earthy tone, I don't mean that, like I said here, not in like a bag kind of a tea sense.
Right.
Like
not
sometimes
in a
that
dirt
tastes
type
like
of a flavor.
Right. It's. You ever had like an Ethiopian coffee? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think.
Yeah.
I think you guys have an Ethiopian coffee.
We don't.
No,
we
okay.
don't. But I have roasted Ethiopian.
Coffee, not
Right, yeah. Ethiopian coffee. I've never roasted any Ethiopian. Sorry, farm kid coming out. But
I just have a bad sense of humor. I don't even have an excuse.
I just had to pick that one up.
That's what I was going for, so I was throwing that one up for you.
Well, our wives looked at us earlier this morning, and they're like, "I think you guys found your soulmate, your bosom buddies or whatever." Like birds of a feather. Yep.
Oh.
But the African coffees tend to be a little bit more of that earthy. Mm-hmm. You'll still notice, like on a Kenyan or a Rwandan, you'll notice some more of the floral notes and that kind of stuff too. But they still have that earthy type of a undertone to them and stuff. So, last time we were talking about how you got involved and stuff, and my computer's going off over here. But anyway, so. I'm going to let you kind of tell that story a little bit.
Yeah, well, it's a really neat story. So, where to begin?
Yeah.
I was sitting at home one day, and it was between Christmas and New Year's. And, and that's normally a little bit of a time where things slow down just a little bit. Mm-hmm. I'm a pretty upbeat person, on the go quite a bit, doing a lot of different projects, things like that. And I was just talking to my wife, and I said, it would be, I would really like to do these three things this year when it comes to podcasting. I'm an avid podcaster, not just listener, but producer, well, not producer, but speaker, I guess. And I said, I'd love to do a podcast on tea. I said, that would be cool. I said, obviously more ministry. I'd love to do more ministry podcasts. That's generally where I'm doing podcasts. I said also American history.
I haven't heard this part of the story. So
I just told my wife that, and I said that this one night, it was a Saturday night. I said I wrote these down. I said I'd really like to do these.
It's funny.
Well, the next day, my wife and I were actually planning on going to a Christmas party, and the Christmas party ended up being that spouses didn't get invited, basically, and nothing wrong with that. Because more people said that they're going to come than what they're anticipating, so they had to cut back somewhere, and they said, don't bring your husbands, basically. And so I ended up being free. We had a babysitter all lined up and everything already, and so I'm like, you know what? We don't have church tonight, because we had our family Sunday where we have an afternoon thing, and we don't have church tonight. I said, you know what? I'm going to go over to Sioux City and come visit your church here at Cornerstone, and we start talking, and we've talked quite a bit before about tea and things like that. And you come up and you go, I'm really thinking about doing this podcast.
Yeah.
And you knew that I did some podcasting, so you're wanting to pick my mind. And you go, it's going to be on tea. It's going to be on ministry in the Bible, and it's going to be on American history from the Founders Bible. And I'm sitting here going like, what?
That's funny. I hadn't heard the Saturday night part of this whole story.
Yeah, I'm at first I'm kind of just playing it off cool. I'm going.
You did.
Oh, that sounds really neat. Yeah, I can help you out with this. And I think we ended up talking. We were for 3 hours or so. Maybe
it was Pastor Carey, myself, Jacob Hall, who runs by the way, I'm going to just give a shout out to my friend Jacob Hall.
Great guy.
Yes, great guy. We both know him real well, and I love Jacob. He goes to church with me up here. He and his wife drive down about an hour, 45 minutes or an hour to come to church. And he runs a website called the Iowa Standard.
And you need to check it out, even if you're not in Iowa.
Right.
The iowastandard.com. Gets national news. Has national news. Definitely, if you're in Iowa, it is the place to go for news.
Jacob he was telling me the other day that he's had over 1 million hits on his website since the beginning of the year.
Yeah, so he's pretty beat up.
Yeah.
1 million hits. Oh,
yeah. But anyway, so I know that he and I have been talking about having him do a story on Teshuah and stuff, and we're actually looking at advertising with him. And I would be giving him the shout out whether he was doing any of that or not, just because I like reading his articles. He writes really well. He digs into the truth of what's going on. He has a lot of good connections in the State House and stuff. So he's good at finding out the nitty gritty and really exposing the truth and stuff. So if you like honest reporting, and like I said, I'm not saying this just because he's my friend. I'm not saying this just because he's talking about doing an interview with us. I just really like Jacob's paper, and he does a really good job. So I'd like to just give him a shout out. And
Pastor Kerry's okay too. He was in the conversation.
Yeah, he was in the conversation too. But going back to Jacob here just for a second, and if you have the opportunity, I don't know if he's gotten a Patreon set up yet, but I know that Jacob has basically, he really hasn't been making a lot of money on this, and he needs to be able to support his family and stuff. So I'd like you to give a shout out to him on that. Just support his newspaper, get a subscription, buy a subscription, support him through Patreon or whatever. But basically help support his newspaper because he does a really fantastic job. And so, but going back to what we were talking about, so it was Jacob Hall and Pastor Kerry and myself and you, and we were sitting there talking, and yeah, I think you and Jacob were there. Pastor Kerry and I both got yelled at by our wives that we needed to go, and why Jacob's wife didn't start yelling at him, I don't know, but
I don't know. Jacob still gives me a hard time about that. He goes, what time did you get home that night? Because it's a 3-hour drive for me. So
I think it was I think you told me it was like 2 o'clock almost or something.
Yeah,
like
it was
that
like 2 in the morning or something. So my wife is very gracious. So
but we had a really good time talking.
Yeah, and I was playing it off, like I said, kind of cool. Like, oh yeah, because I'm going. You're kidding. I was literally just came up with this last night, and I had just been thinking about this, and I'm like, wait, all 3 podcasts in one? That would be kind of nice. And I'm going I don't want to invite myself onto your podcast or anything like that, is what I was thinking.
Yeah.
And so I just kind of go, I've been thinking about a podcast like that. It's kind of how I broke it to you.
Yeah.
I was I don't want to overstep my bounds, but what do you think about doing it together?
Yeah. I really like this tea, but it's been a lot of fun. I've enjoyed doing this and stuff, and so that's kind of where Teshuah, or the Teshuah Unveiled podcast got started and stuff, and it's just interesting how when you really are submitting yourself to God and you're really seeking His will and you're really seeking to do what He wants, it's amazing the connections that happen and things that you're like. Pastor David Salish, or Salish, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your last name wrong.
Nobody ever mispronounces my last name.
Yeah,
I'm just going to throw that out
pretty
there.
hard. It's probably Salish, because it's Salch. And I have not asked him how to pronounce it yet. But anyway, he and I were talking a week ago, and we were talking about how... I said that even though sales have not been to the level that I want them at for Teshuah and stuff, it's been amazing to me how we've been able to keep going and how God has brought us through. And in case you're wondering, yes, Teshuah is still open. Because we're a one-man shop, I don't need to worry about it. So, we are still open. We're still roasting. We're still shipping. We're not having a problem getting products right now. Andrew is staying here in the States until I think August or September sometime, until the fall anyway. And but we are still able to get products, and he still has people that can ship for us and stuff. So we are still doing all that. and hopefully you'll be able to start seeing a lot more from Teshuah after next week. We made it into the top 100 for the FedEx Small Business Grant Competition, which was really, really cool.
Might be a lot more grants for small businesses going out there soon.
Yeah, but FedEx had this grant competition way before COVID-19 ever started. This is something they've actually done for several years, and so we actually finished in the top 100 this year, and so we're hoping that they're going to make the final announcement on Monday. So this show will be out by then, I guess, but they will be making the announcement. So hopefully we'll finish really well and see what happens from there. So, any more thoughts along those lines?
Well, explain the grant just a little bit here. What's kind of the what would you do if you won the grant?
Well, what we're looking at doing, it depends on the level, because there's three levels and 12 total awards. So the grand prize is $50,000 in cash, and then $7,500 in FedEx print and business services, which is really funny for me because my wife runs our printing business. By the way, if you need some printing, you can call my wife. She actually does all of our labels and all that stuff for Teshuah and stuff, and has done a really good job.
I was going to grab something and show it, but I was going to say it looks really nice, but we don't have any for it. Right there, so.
However, we don't actually run the process. We're actually a broker, so that allows us to be able to get better pricing because we can shop around and stuff, and we know a lot of the really reliable sources, and so we have a relationship with all these different companies. So it's really nice. But I digress. So anyway, so then 50,000 and 7,500, and then second place is 30,000, and I think like 5,000 in print and business services, and then third through 12th place is $15,000 in grant money and $1,500 or $1,000 in print and business services. So that could be a big boost for us. Some of the things that we're wanting to do is to be able to get some K-Cup producing equipment, so we could actually start doing K-Cups for the coffee.
Okay, and I think good. For a second there, I was thinking with a tea. I'm going, I don't think that's going to go so well.
Actually, I think that there is a method now for doing tea. I don't know. I got to look into it more on how that would go for. I'm
not sure. It's been a while since we've done. We used to have a Keurig, and we don't have one anymore. So It's been a while since we've done that. But I think that's a great avenue, though.
Mm-hmm. Well, and a lot of people do drink Keurigs. I personally am a much more of a. I like grinding it fresh and having it fresh that day.
You know what I learned is when you get a kid, you have to go from a cup of coffee a day to a pot of coffee a day.
Yeah.
So
right.
Yeah,
I drink 3 pints. I drink 3 pints a day. So yeah. Yeah.
Ooh, that's really good there. That steep.
Yeah, it's getting stronger, and it's getting more of the flavors released out of it. It's getting more of the dry mouthfeel to it. So it's changing, and that's the thing I enjoy about it is you're sitting here drinking it over the course of the day. It's fun just to see how it changes and develops over the time, and you would never. I mean, my wife likes to drink, especially before we started getting. I'll clarify. Before we started doing this, she would always just drink, bag tea and stuff, and she'd get a cup and a half out of it if he was lucky, and she oversteeps your tea as far as I'm concerned. But anyway, so I lost my train of thought where we were going.
The different tiers. So what would you do? One would be K-Cups.
Yeah, K-Cups, and then there's a piece of equipment, and I'm trying to think of the name of it. It's a really interesting piece of equipment. It's very rare. It's not something you're going to see around pretty much anywhere. In fact, I'm having a hard time even remembering the name of it because it's just that unusual. It begins with a B, but it's a piece of equipment that does infusions, and you can do. It works on barometric pressure, and I don't totally understand this piece of equipment, but except it's really, really cool. I've gotten into it far enough to know that. It's really neat because you can put tea in it, you can put fruit in it, or you can put coffee in it, and you can make an infusion out of any of these different items, or you can do...
So this is how you could get some fruity flavored teas, or
Yeah.
better fruity flavored tea kind of a
Or
thing.
like, or if you actually put the fruit in there and you're making infusions, you're actually making like almost like a natural syrup out of the fruit. It's like extraction and infusion, and it's really just a neat piece of equipment. And one of the things that we would like to do is open a tea shop so that we actually had a physical location, and you know, that's something else that Pastor David and I were talking about last week, is how it's interesting how when you're really pushing and really seeking God and really wanting His will, He'll also protect you. You'll have something, you're like, okay, I know this is from God. I know that this idea is I really believe it's from the Holy Spirit and stuff. But then you start getting into it, and you start pushing on it and pushing on it and pushing on it, and it's just like, it's not working, it's not working, it's not working. But you're like, there's still something here, and I can't quit pushing on it, but why isn't this going? And then all of a sudden COVID-19 hits, and everything shuts down.
Yep.
And I know that some friends of mine just opened a coffee shop a year ago, and then I had some other friends of mine that were just getting ready to open one, and COVID-19 hit, and they can't open, or they had to shut down after a year. And I'm like, man.
And that's tough on business right there.
It's very tough on a business.
And, you think about that, it's not just God's plan that's perfect in the general sense as to the end result. It's also His timing that's perfect.
And you can look at this scenario throughout history. I mean, think about how different the world would have been changed if Abraham, would have just kept his pants on and not gone and listened to his wife when she said take Hagar. When Sarah said take Hagar, you wouldn't have Ishmael, and you wouldn't have a lot of the Arab countries that are
descendants
of Ishmael, and have caused untold deaths. And I'm not trying to be mean, but it would be different. It would be way different. And Abraham, one man's, okay, God gave me this promise, but I'm going to push ahead on it and make it happen myself. I'm going to take it into my own hands, and whether I'm getting a wait or a no on it for right now, I'm just going to push ahead and do what I want. And how would the world have been different if Abraham would have just been patient and said, okay, God's timing is perfect. Yeah, I don't want to wait 20 years. You know what? I haven't wanted to wait 20 years on getting to where, Megan and I wrote down our goals years and years ago. Before I ever started working at Fairway, we were both talking about working at Fairway and stuff. And actually, I think I was working at Fairway already, but we had gone up to a couple that we know up to their house for Thanksgiving. And the wife and the family, she said, you guys need to write down what your family goal is, what your goals are, and your plans and your dreams as a family. What are the things that you feel like God is saying? And she said, take time with it. Really dig in and take time and really pray and really seek God and really go after it. And take that and listen to what you feel like God is saying to you as far as the plans that He has for your family. Dive into it and then lay that down and go, okay, God, here's what we're planning on. Here's what we feel like you're speaking to us, and now we're going to put feet to the ground and just start moving, and we'll just move as far as we can, as fast as we can, basically. And we had the dream to have our acreage working, and to have an internet business and be able to have our kids involved with the business and or be able to work alongside of our children and stuff. And it's now almost 20 years later, it's just now that has really started to come
Materialize.
to materialize and to come into play and stuff. And so I would really encourage people to not be impatient with God and just to keep taking steps, to keep, my wife is like, you're always coming up with new ideas. And I'm like, yeah, I am, but there's a caveat to it. Those ideas always fit within those 3 goals that we laid out. Mm-hmm. We've had our Safeguard business, our printing business for years, and that is internet based and stuff, and it's helped provide for our family and stuff over the years. But I knew that it wasn't the per se. That wasn't the final.
The end.
The end goal or the end business for what God really wanted for us for the internet business or whatever, and so everything is now, like I said, finally coming into fruition and to coming into full reality and stuff. So it's really interesting. So,
20 years ago, you envisioned an internet business, huh?
Mm-hmm. Almost 20 years ago.
Wow.
Probably 2002, 2003, somewhere in there.
Yeah. I mean, there was definitely internet back then, but it's
right.
That's that idea of that would have been kind of a cutting edge idea there. That
is where the market it was starting. eBay was already out.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
I know you're not old enough to remember that.
I remember eBay.
But
although I was about
8.
10, 10 when you're the range that you're talking in 2002, 2003, 10, 11, but
yeah. Internet, really? Play Donkey Kong on there, can't you?
Well, I'm just constantly hearing the dial-up tones.
Oh yeah, in the AOL.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you remember AOL?
Oh yeah.
I have a friend of mine that she still uses AOL. I'm like, she's in her 70s, but I see, like, you still use it? AOL's still a thing? Yeah, they're still a thing, I guess.
Oh, yeah, yeah, that's crazy. But should we get into some stories about the girls?
Yeah, we should. So, you know what? I'm going to have you read these because I don't have my glasses on.
Oh, boy.
So
I haven't looked at these ahead of time, so we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, so we're going to share 2 stories, and another reason that I'm going to have Pastor Sam read them is because I probably won't make him through them without crying.
And can I use the actual name that's there? Okay.
Yeah, I have it on the website, so you can actually use their name.
So we'll see here. I'm really impressed. Brad actually thinks I can read. So,
well, that was one of the reasons I asked you to do this, because my tongue gets twisted once in a while, and my kids all go, "Okay, Dad, let somebody else read."
So we'll start here. Miss Li Ming. Mm-hmm. We rescued Miss Li Ming from sex trafficking, and she agreed to transition into our Teshuah House rehab home. After moving, our staff found out she had horrible night terrors. Several times every night. Mm-hmm. Wow. And you can only imagine why. I mean, right. that's the reality.
Andrew goes on to explain.
Yeah. We like to joke around and have fun, mm-hmm. but there is a lot of seriousness to mm-hmm. this podcast, to this ministry, mm-hmm. and so we don't want you to think that though we're joking around and having fun, that we take this lightly.
Right.
This is serious
we don't.
Stuff.
We don't. And I do want to hit on that for a minute, because mm-hmm. that brings up an interesting point, because while we do laugh and joke around, in some ways, at least for me personally, I have to. My parents always, my parents, I was born and raised on a dairy farm about 7 miles from here, from where I live now, and my parents went through the farm crisis of the early 80s, and I remember one of my parents' favorite expressions was, "You might as well laugh about it, otherwise you'll cry," and that's really true, because mm-hmm. Doing what I do, I see so much of the dregs of humanity. I hear so many of the stories, and and stuff, that you have to counterbalance that with some of the comic relief and the humor and stuff, because otherwise you would just drive yourself batty. And but at the same time, laughter does good like a medicine. And so when you, and that's scriptural, when you're dealing with the dregs of humanity and you're dealing in society and stuff, you really have to have that laughter, because what it does is it restores your soul. And it helps you as a person be able to deal with it. It helps you to just be able to understand that there's darkness in the world, but that we can still have humor and we can still laugh and we can still have fun. I mean, Andrew works with this stuff on a daily basis, and you're not going to find...
He's a fun guy.
He really is. He has a great sense of humor. But that's what keeps us sane. That's what, you can... It helps with combat weariness. Laughter and humor and that stuff really helps with combat humor, or with combat weariness. And my kids will, and my wife always, they're always laughing at me, because even though that humor is always right on the surface and stuff, right below that, it's pretty easy for me to cry. And I don't try to. I mean, I'm a farm kid from Iowa. That's not, but, having been through the tractor accident and having been through all this different stuff, there's some stories that I can't make it through them very well without having to stop and get my composure and stuff, because it just is something that drives me. It's something that propels me, and so there has to be that balance to, I remember years and years ago, I was in my apartment. I lived in Omaha. I had shared a house with some guys, and I was in my room. And we were kind of down on 20th and Dodge area of Omaha, which is kind of the older...
Okay.
Omaha, the way Omaha, Nebraska has grown is you start at the river, and Omaha is really well laid out. They had a genius that laid out that town. Because it starts at 0 base, or 1 as First Street, and it goes all the way out number-wise. It's not like Sioux City where they go from 5th to 11th or 8th to 14th, and you're like, who did this? Why? I mean, you can go from the 500 block to the 1100 block on one side of the street to the other side of the street in Sioux City, and you're like, who did this?
Somebody who couldn't count.
Yeah, but Omaha is laid out on a 1 mile grid and so on and so forth. So 20th Street, that's really down in the old part of Omaha. And I remember looking out of my bedroom one day, and I will never forget this. And it was like, it was almost like God opened my ears to society and to the humanity and to what was going on. And I won't say it was audible, but it was so close to it that it was almost, you could hear just the oppression, the depression, the cries of humanity, and it was almost overwhelming. And I'm like, I can't go here. But now over time, I had to kind of repent for that, for pushing that off or whatever a little bit. But now, being in a different place and different age and different time and so on and so forth, now with maturity, I've learned to handle that, both aspects of it, and to still have the fun and be able to goof around and joke around and yet still be able to take it seriously and understand what's out there and understand the depths of the depravity of humanity, and understand that I know who my Redeemer is. And so even though I see humanity in such a cesspool, I can still reach down and I can grab people and pull them out, because I'm standing on the solid ground, and I know whom I believed and who my Redeemer is, and I know in whom my hope and my trust is. And so I can look forward to the soon coming King's return while still being able to do what I need to do, grabbing people out, and it's really an interesting dichotomy to go through. But I don't mean to get way off the subject, but I think it helps people understand some things.
Right. And I'll just go ahead and start this one over, but wow, what a powerful story here. I read it through real quick, and it's Miss Leeming. We rescued Miss Leeming from sex trafficking, and she agreed to transition into our Teshuah house rehab home. After moving in, our staff found out that she had horrible night terrors several times every night. Nightly, she was reminded of the horrendous abuse she had been subject to for 3 years as a preteen and teen. Just think about that for a moment. The age of these girls, I mean, preteen's really young. She'd been sold several times every night like a piece of meat to customers who would rape her. She'd been forced to have 2 abortions while being trafficked. In her rescue, after her rescue for 27 days, she received psychological counseling every day. She also attended Bible studies. On the 28th day, this is awesome, she chose to place her faith in Jesus Christ and to confess Him as her Lord and Savior. Right. Amen. Isn't that awesome? That's what it's about. That night, for the first time in years, she slept 9 hours in peace with no nightmares, and she woke up rested and refreshed. Since being set free from this bondage, she has been able to concentrate better on her studies, and she went from having the lowest scores in her schoolwork to having some of the highest scores. Wow. Talk about just a transformation in life. And you know, that's what the gospel does. That's what Jesus does. He comes in, and it says that He makes us, we're old creatures, and then He makes us new. It tells us in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. And it's not just about the benefits. And look at this here. She didn't come to Jesus to get rid of her night terrors.
Right.
She didn't come to Jesus to get better test scores. You know, some people might try to pull those things. But the reality of it is that when you come to Jesus and you live for Him, because she didn't just make Him her Savior, Lord too. Well, what ends up happening is your life goes for the better because God's way is the best way.
Right.
Isn't that awesome?
Right. Well, and I think that people, you know, this story in particular, I didn't set it up this way, but God set it up this way as far as what we were just talking about, because I think it really hits to the point of, you know, what we were talking about of how can you live in both worlds and still maintain your sanity? It's because I know the stories. I know
the redemption.
I know the redemption. And I can see the redemption on a daily basis. And I can look at people, you know, people sometimes go, how do you not just want to find some of these traffickers and just execute them? And yeah, that's I won't ever say that never crosses the mind. You know, when you hear some of these stories, it's like if I could just rip their head off, I would. And I wouldn't have a problem in it. And I'm not trying to be crass. I'm not trying to be, you know, mean or whatever. But to know what they did to these little girls, yeah, it infuriates me. But Jesus said the same thing. Jesus said, you know, if one of you causes one of these little ones to fall, it would have been better for you if you'd had a millstone tied around your neck and you'd have been thrown into the sea. So Jesus isn't kind about it. His thoughts on hurting a little one,
they're serious.
They're serious, and He takes it serious. Now, having said that, the Scripture always talks about that justice is seasoned with mercy, and you know, Ron Wyatt years ago supposedly found the Ark of the Covenant. And where they found it was really interesting. And I've watched the videos. Their cameras would not work when they tried to take video of it. And the Jewish Sanhedrin said, we are going to keep this quiet. We're not going to publish this, because if the Zionists figured out where this thing was, all hell would break loose, and we would have World War III on our hands, because the Zionists would, you know, so the Jewish Sanhedrin was like, we're going to just keep this quiet for now. But they found it in Jeremiah's grotto But the cool part about the whole story is, so they went in and they found this crack in the wall or in the rock, and they figured out that there was a cave back there, and so they broke through and they found this passageway, and they had to slither in, basically see some really tight spots and stuff, and they got into there, and they found as they climbed into this room, that they found that they were crawling across some artifacts and that were covered over by skins and stuff, and like animal skins, and they realized that they were crawling across the table of showbread and some of the other temple artifacts that have never been found. And they said they got in there and they were scanning their lights around the room, and they found this stone sarcophagus over in the one corner of the room. And then when they went over there, the lid of the stone sarcophagus was split in half, and it was open, and there sat the Ark of the Covenant and the mercy seat right there. But they noticed that when they were looking through here, they saw this brown liquid on top of the ceiling, and it was also on top of the ark. And they noticed it on the ark first, and then they looked up and they saw this brown liquid on the ceiling, and they noticed this crack in the ground or the ceiling above. And so they ran a tape measure up through the ground, and as they're running up through the ground, they had somebody up on the top side standing there, and they found these 3 square holes that had caps in them, but there was a fourth one. So there's 3 in a row, but there was a fourth one that was up higher. And if you read, now understand, I take this with a grain of salt, but the way it all plays out and the way it's all pictured and the way the story is told in the Bible, it all bears witness to my mind. And anyway, so they ran this tape measure up, and like I said, there's 3 holes in the ground. The tape measure didn't come up in any one of these 3. It came up in the fourth one, which was up higher. And if you read in the scriptural account, they said they went from the one thief on the cross and they broke his legs. Jesus was in the middle. Why didn't they go to his legs second? They went to the third one first. And then it says, then they went up to Jesus and broke his leg, or were going to break his legs.
Yeah,
but they found out that he was already dead. And so they went to this guy, broke his legs. They went to this guy and broke his legs. Jesus was in the middle. They should have stopped there first, but they went over him, and then they went up to the fourth hole. And the fourth hole is where that tape measure came down, and the blood and the water spilled down through the crack in the ground. And the Bible always talks about that there was an earthquake that rent the ground in asunder, and the blood and water flowed, and the earth opened up to receive the blood of Christ, and it poured out onto the mercy seat. And all this picture makes absolute sense to my mind, that God, if you're a just and loving God, and knowing what we know about the Old Testament temple, this is going to make a great segue into the next segment here. But the priest would always take the blood of the covenant, the blood of testimony, and they would take it into the Holy of Holies, and they would pour it on the mercy seat. Well, if you're God and you're going to sacrifice your own son, where would you want that blood to go? You'd want it to go on the mercy seat. And when the earthquake happened, it started. The epicenter was right there at that stone sarcophagus. It split in half. It opened up to receive the blood of our Savior, and it poured down on the mercy seat, and you have justice and mercy kissed at the mercy seat. And so while Jesus is really serious about, if you don't repent and you hurt one of the little ones, it won't go well for you. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, he's willing to extend mercy, as we've seen several times with the brothel owners that have been delivered. He's willing to forgive. Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter what you've done. He's willing to forgive, and he's willing to redeem, and he's willing to deliver you. But it takes that willingness to ask for forgiveness.
Right. There's a responsibility of man, and I do love that idea of the mercy and justice coming together because, and of course, I don't want to say mercy wins out because I'm not. We're not universalists. Not everybody gets mercy. It's those who ask who get mercy.
Who ask.
Whosoever calls upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. But it's you look at that there. God doesn't compromise on who He is, and that's why a price had to be paid. But His blood was spilled, even for these wicked men that we read about in these stories.
Right.
That do these horrible things, and there is forgiveness for them if they turn to Jesus Christ. But there is punishment for them if they don't turn to Jesus Christ.
Yep.
Did you read the next one? Or
let's
you
go ahead and read the next one.
So this is Miss Wang Jing. Miss Wang Jing became an orphan at age 9 and ended up living on the street at age 14. After turning 15, she was kidnapped and forced into sex trafficking. 9 months later, we rescued her and brought her into our Teshuah House rehab home. Upon arrival, she was completely illiterate, stuttered when talking. After 15 months in our program, she was able to read on a 6th grade level in her native language. She no longer stutters and is enjoying learning Korean as a second language. When we rescued her, her height and weight were all below average for her age. After receiving 3 meals a day and living in a loving environment, her height and weight are now correct according to medical standards. Now, in her free time, she is developing her gift of drawing and painting and enjoys practicing every day. I mean, so you can just see I love these 2 words here. Well, I don't love one of them, but she was kidnapped and forced, and then then the other one is she was rescued. Kidnapped and forced to being rescued, and that's what this ministry does. And of course, it also doesn't just rescue from the terrible circumstances.
Right.
It rescues from sin, but you do see it is a rescuing from these terrible circumstances also.
Right. And in 15 months, she goes from not being able to read to 6th grade level and learning a second language. And as I've said in earlier podcasts, I a lot of times have problems with the English language, let alone reading, or learning. My family's nationality is German, and I'd like to learn German, but we won't. I don't hold out a lot of hope on that.
I can't speak German, but I can eat German.
I can't do. We are in Iowa.
That's right.
There's a lot of Germanic food here.
Yeah. So just looking at the time here, we got about 5 minutes.
Okay.
For our kind of allotted anyway. Sometimes we go a little over, but
yeah.
Where do we want to go for the temple?
Yeah, I want to go for the temple, and I don't know where it's.
Sometimes we prepare ahead of time.
Yeah.
Sometimes we don't.
At least sometimes we don't. Well, and I wasn't planning on necessarily reading it out of there, but more discussing just the design of it because sometimes you get lost on the minutia of God was so detail oriented, and I'm not disparaging that.
No.
But sometimes you just get lost on all the minutia of all the little details that you miss the big picture of what it actually looked like. And
the first time I had my eyes open to that was I was reading a book called Handfuls on Purpose, and I remember the guy who wrote it, James Smith. And this was written back in the, I think, 1800s. I like to collect old books.
Okay.
And it might have been early 1900s, so don't quote me on that 1800s thing. But basically, he went and it's a 10-volume series, where it might be 12, but he goes through and he gives basically sermon outlines. And I was reading this in little study guides. I was reading this when I was in high school, and I remember reading through Leviticus and reading through it and going over the tabernacle and then the temple, and you're like, sometimes you're going, oh man, I gotta read that. But then I'm reading his notes and I'm going, oh, never thought about it like that. Starts talking about the veil. And I'll just go over this quick, because I know you've got a lot that you want to get into. The veil there, it had a red color and had a blue color, and then of course it made a purple color. He starts talking about how the red it's represents the red earth and that idea of mankind, And then the blue is the sky. And it represents that idea of heaven. And Jesus, of course, he is 100% man and 100% God. And so when you put those together, it makes a purple, which is royalty for one, is what it talks to. But also that hypostatic union of Christ, that he's 100% God, 100% man. He's not this weird-natured thing or something like that, but he is the perfect God-man, the only one who can be that mediator.
Right.
And saying how that's a type of Christ, a picture of who Christ is. And of course, that mediator, that's what the veil did, is it was in between man and God, the holiest of holies there in that.
Well, and I think that that's a neat picture because God says that he created man in the likeness and image of himself. And so it's very, very, it's not this oogly spoogly idea that Jesus would, be able to be 100% God and 100% man, because he was created in we were created in the likeness and image of God. We were created after him. And the Bible says that we're created just a little lower than the Elohim, which does not mean angels. It actually means God himself. So we were above the angels, but we're just a little bit lower than God. And we're created to be that family that he wanted and stuff. And when you look at the temple design, Paul talks about, he says something in the New Testament. He says, let me see if I can quote it correctly here. I may have to paraphrase it a little bit, but he basically says that I speak to you a mystery of Christ and the church, and how
Ephesians 5, yeah.
Yeah, in Ephesians 5, and how we're marriage, because he's talking about marriage, and he said, I'm speaking to you about marriage, but I speak to you of a mystery of Christ and the church. Well, if you think about it, and this is such a beautiful picture of the temple is such a beautiful picture of marriage, and people are like, how can a building be a picture of marriage? Well, it's really, really simple, actually. Okay, so what does God say? He wants us to come into marriage pure and undefiled. And what's he say when he says come into the temple? Come in pure and undefiled. Well, our sin keeps us from doing that, so we have to have the blood of Christ. But once we've been washed in the blood, we're able to come into the temple and enter in by the blood of the Lamb. But in the temple, you've got 3 rooms, basically. You've got the outer court where the Gentiles could be. You've got the inner court. Well, actually, there's 4 rooms. There's the outer court, there's the inner court, then there's the holy place.
There's the holiest of holies.
And then the Holy of Holies. And so you've got, the outer court was where the Gentiles were allowed to go. The inner court was where the Jews were allowed to go. And then the holy place was where the priests were allowed to go. And then the Holy of Holies was only where a priest was allowed to go once a year, but he had to enter through the blood.
Right. I can't remember if we talked about this or not on another one, but like he would, it was a serious thing. He wore bells on the bottom of his clothing, so because if he went in there not right with God, God is going to strike him dead, because God is just.
Right.
Just as we're talking about there. And because he wasn't equipped to go, what priests do. Priests, so you got prophets and priests. Prophets speak God's message from God to man. Priests plead man's case before God. And so, and that doesn't mean that priests didn't, preach or lead and worship and things like that.
Right.
But these are just the general principle there. And so if the priest wasn't ready to plead man's case, the high priest is actually what we're talking about here, before God would strike him dead. And so if the bells quit jingling for a certain amount of time, they had a rope tied around the guy's ankle, and they'd pull him out, because they knew if they went in there, God would not be pleased, because there was only one that was supposed to go in there, as you said, once a year.
Right. But it was only one. It wasn't 2, it wasn't 3, it wasn't 4, it wasn't 5, it wasn't 10. 1.
Right.
And if you stop and look at this, the marriage bed is really such a picture of the temple. when a man and a woman come together in marriage, they go from the inner court. They've gone from the outer court where they're courting. They've moved to the inner court where they're engaged. They move from the inner court where they're engaged into the holy place where they're coming before the Lord and they're committing their marriage to Christ and to Father God. And when they come to that place before the throne, that marriage ceremony is a picture of the holy place where they're committing their marriage to God. But then they come together in union in the consummation of the marriage and what is supposed to happen. And part of the reason that God is, and this is one of the things that I wish I would have known years ago, but when a man and woman come together in the holy matrimony, and they come together pure and undefiled, they come in and the hymen in the woman breaks and blood is spilled, and they enter into the holy place, and I'm not getting into some weird woman worship here or anything like that, but it's a picture. That holy place of the consummation of the marriage is one person entering the holy place through the shedding of blood, and it's a picture of Christ in the church. Mm-hmm. And now, is there restoration if we've screwed up that picture? If we've messed around where we shouldn't have been messing around? And absolutely, there is restoration. There is 100% restoration. But when it's done perfectly and when it's done in God's way and God's manner and God's timing and all that stuff flows together like it's supposed to, it is an absolutely beautiful picture of Christ in the church. And that is one of the reasons that we have this friend of mine, Brad, he and I were talking yesterday, and we were talking about this, and we were discussing marriage and stuff, and I said, marriage is a picture of Christ in the church, but it's to be a lifelong covenant with one person in that relationship, that God wants us to fellowship with Him in the same intimacy that a man and a woman would fellowship. And I'm not necessarily talking about the marriage bed. I'm talking about the intimate conversations, the intimate times together. My wife knows me better than anybody else knows me.
Right. Well, that phrase in Genesis 1 when it says, "And the two shall become one flesh." Obviously, there's sexual implication there. We understand that. But it also has other implication. It's that idea of their hand in hand too. It's not just that idea of a marriage bed that it's talking about. It is talking about that idea that a man and a woman can come hand in hand. And I don't really. I mean, other than like our son's one. Okay, I might reach and hold his hand or something, and little kid across the streets, but I don't really do a whole lot of hand holding.
Right.
If you notice, we don't hold hands while we do the podcast.
That's good.
Yeah, I'm glad.
I'm very grateful.
But it's that idea of a husband and wife do have or should have a different relationship. Satan has done, and I don't want to get too far into this because obviously we've run out of time here, but Satan has done a great job of messing with marriage, and not just in the sense of homosexuality. But I mean, I've talked to people who get married, and they live completely separate lives. They don't live a life hand in hand together.
Right.
They're not together, and that's not how God designed marriage. Right. All the wives right now are amen, because they want that hand in hand life. They have that great desire. Men, there's nothing wrong with having a man cave, something like that. But you're not to go into retreat to your man cave and neglect your wife. Right.
She is supposed to be, and this is one of the things that I have said over the years, and there's such a rampant divorce culture, and we don't value and esteem the person that's in our lives, and when we self-focus and think only of ourselves, and we become self-absorbed, and we don't prefer one another. The scripture talks about husbands, honor your wives. Wives, submit to your husbands. And when both of those things happen, it's a beautiful picture, because why wouldn't I want to honor my wife that's submitting to me, and why wouldn't she, if I'm doing that for her, she's going to want to come up under
In respect?
in my protection and in respect and everything else. And
I had an opportunity to walk into a lion's den once, and not really figuratively here. It was it was an interview about a stand I was taking. We were running a prayer meeting for Pride Fest coming into town.
Okay.
And I was contacted by somebody who was a freelance writer, and she was also a lesbian who was organizing the Pride Fest. And she said, "Will you do an interview?" I said, "Yes." A lot of people said, "You're crazy." But I was able to sit there and talk to her. And of course, we had major disagreements.
Right.
But she came out I think it was in the middle of the interview, or maybe it was right after. She said, "There's no doubt you're coming from a position of love. I disagree with you, but you're coming from a position of love," which was something that she didn't expect to say. I can tell you that. But we were talking, and she was bashing on the idea of the order of marriage and man and woman, which of course is what we would hold to. And I said, "Well, that's what you're explaining. Isn't it all what it is?" I said, "No, let me explain to you. Ephesians 5. Husbands are to lead, but they're not to run over their wives.
Right.
They're to lead in a loving way, caring for the needs of their wife. And wives are supposed to submit. They're supposed to respect their husbands, but they're supposed to follow their husbands only in as far as what the Bible covers. They're not supposed to follow their husband into tyranny,
or into immorality.
Right, or into immorality or into sin. And so it's not just, submit. And it's also not, because we've overly corrected in the church today, gone off into the other ditch where it's just husbands love, and never get to hear wives submitting anymore, as a lot of times. It's these two things that work together. It's a complement for one another.
Right.
And as they work together, works best because it's God's design. Somebody does have to lead. You don't go anywhere if nobody's leading, and that means somebody has to follow. Because if you're both leading in one direction and the other one's leading in another direction, then you're just playing tug of war and pulling each other apart. And so somebody does have to lead and somebody does have to follow, but it's not a running over and it's not an undercutting. It's a working together.
Well, a two-person bicycle is a great picture of this, because if you have one person in the lead and they're pedaling, you're both on this together. You're both in here together. Or a two-person kayak. In fact, our pastors have told people that they should go kayaking together in a two-person kayak before they get married, before they say "I do," because they need to figure out, okay, only one person can be the lead, because if both people are trying to lead, you're going to lead in different directions. And so if the man in front or the person in front is going to the left, and the person in the back is trying to lean to the right and take the bike to the right, you're going to have an accident. It's not going to stay up.
Well, can you imagine if in a kayak somebody's back paddling and somebody's forward paddling? I mean, you might go somewhere because somebody might be stronger than the other person, but you're not really going to go anywhere.
And you're not going to get fast.
No.
You're not going to be able to win the race. You're not going to
wear each other out. It's going to be frustrating. So it works together, but
right. And I've said to people over the years, my wife, going back to what we were talking about with the divorce culture is we want to throw our wives away and get the better upgrade, the newer model, so to speak.
And sometimes it is the newer model. That's what
it is the newer model, but the problem with that is, when you're old and you're laying on your deathbed, you want that person that's been there those 80 years or those 70 years or those 60 years or 50 years or whatever it's been. My parents were married for 45 years before my dad passed away, or 46. I don't remember. But anyway, so my mom was the repository of all the memories, good, bad, ugly, indifferent, whatever. She was the repository of all my dad's memories. And yet, had my mom died first, my dad would have been the repository of all her memories. And so us as kids can come and draw from those memories, and we can pull on. And so when you upgrade to the newer model, it's kind of like taking your computer and erasing the original hard drive and starting over. You don't have all the important documents. You don't have all the important memories.
All the firsts together.
All
You're
the
no longer
firsts together.
anymore if you've done it twice.
Right.
You know?
And you're missing that. And yes, there's repentance for people that have screwed up and gotten divorced or whatever. Yes, there's repentance for that. But wouldn't it be better just to do it right in the first place and have all those memories and all those things stored up?
This is kind of a tea podcast. One of the biggest consumers of tea are millennials. Mm-hmm. Most millennials haven't gotten married yet. Mm-hmm. Don't mess it up.
Right. Exactly.
I'm looking here, and you're speaking of your wife, and she's wonderful.
She's making lunch.
and she's a wonderful cook. So that's exactly where I was going with that. And we're half an hour later than what we said we would be. So
we started
won't
later too,
surprise
but
them,
it won't surprise them. But anyway, guys, thank you so much for joining us. We'll probably pick up here a little bit next time and talk more about it, because we do want you to have successful marriages and stuff. So thank you for being here, and we appreciate it. Have a great day. Bye. Today's show has been brought to you by Teshuah Tea Company and Dynamic Script. You've been listening to Teshuah Unveiled on the Unresolved Podcast Network.